What is Ukrainian literature? How do we know how old it is? How did the numerous language bands influence its formation? Who are the essential figures of Ukrainian literature? In this video, we will follow the chronology and describe the brightest and most unique facts. Sometime your heart leads you. It dictates, loves, aches, and shivers. And sometimes we will follow our wisdom and intellect. Ukrainian literature, though oppressed and banned during the centuries, was robust, original, and self-sufficient. First of all, we should specify what ancient Rus was. Ancient Rus is not the same as today's Russia, though the similarity of names is not a coincidence. Historically, Rus is ancient Ukraine. The name Ukraine was used for the land of Cossacks since about the mid-17th century. That's why the prominent historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky used the name Ukraine Rus to underline ethnic and historical continuity. As far as we know, the name Ukraine was first mentioned in the Cave Chronicles in 1187, but it became widespread only in the early 20th century. From the 10th to 17th century, most books were written in religious institutions. So the literature of the time had its clear function as early as in the Tale of Bygone Years Chronicle. In books, we learn and are instructed to follow the path of penitence, for wisdom and temperance we gain from the written words. The Christian paradigm, of course, influenced the genres of writing. Sometimes the search of symbols and allegories influenced the understanding of the world. For example, the author of the treatise Physiologist described real as well as fantastic creatures. The stories were full of biblical allegories rather than biological facts. In those times, the author was regarded not as a writer, but rather as the person who realizes God's will. The time of old literature, with all its strange creatures, is followed by the printing age. The wave of Renaissance culture reached Ukraine and triggered the rebirth of national culture. In 1483, the book by Ukrainian scientist Yuri Kotermak, the rector of the prestigious University of Bologna, is published. Though it was an astrological pamphlet in Latin named The Clear Prognostic for the current year 1483, it was the first printed book written by a Ukrainian. The start was initiated. In 1491, the first Cyrillic texts were printed. And finally, in 1574 in Lviv, Ivan Fedorovich printed the first book in Ukraine, Apostle, and the first dictionary in Eastern Slavic lands, Bukvar. Then, in the late 16th to early 17th century, Ukrainian culture is dominated by the Baroque style. The word Barocco means a pearl of a bizarre form, something both precious and eccentric. In Ukraine during that time, the Baroque style was everywhere. In religious architecture, in art, in fashion, and in language. And of course, in literature, where the dominant traditional spiritual component is playfully combined with classical mythology. In poetry, it is a time of syllabic verse, which has an equal number of syllables in every line. Authors play and experiment with poetic forms. The champion of this was Ivan Velichkovsky. This is how he managed to incorporate his name into one of his poems. Look at the yellow letters. Historical songs and epic sung poems, dumas, are very popular. And the kobzars, the singers who perform them playing the kobza or bandura, become very important figures in folk culture. The kobzar will become a true archetype of Ukrainian literature. And in the Baroque era, the common Rus language became more widely used. In texts, it gradually becomes more widespread than the bookish Slavic Rus language, the Ukrainian version of Church Slavic. But in 1720, Ukraine being a part of the Russian Empire, Tsar Peter I will ban printing of any books in Ukrainian. Half a century later, in 1775, Russian troops will destroy the main Cossack stronghold, Zaporizhian Sich. The unruly element of burlesque is raging in Ukrainian literature. The 19th century shows that lowly things are able to express lofty ideas. Laughter even had something sacred in it. The question was posed by Hrigorij Skovoroda: had Jesus ever laughed? And he had his answer. It was yes. The key figure of that period is Ivan Kotlяревский. He works on the remake of Virgil's The Aeneid. This epic and burlesque poem shows that humor and the ability to laugh in any situation is in the Ukrainian national psyche. And the choice of Kotlяревский's imitators to write in this style and in Ukrainian demonstrated their separation from the context of the Russian Empire. The element of Ukrainian humor storms into the Russian Empire with Mykola Gogol. Gogol teaches Russia to laugh. But it's not only about laughing in pleasure. In the 19th century, the main canonic figures of Ukrainian literature and conscience arise. They are Taras Shevchenko, Lesya Ukrainka, and Ivan Franko. Taras Shevchenko is called Kobzar even during his own lifetime. He came from a simple background and wrote for them. He was the embodiment of collective memory, the fighter for truth and justice. Ivan Franko gets the name the Rock Breaker, a realist and atheist, an active person with focused ideas of society, and also a poet, writer, translator, and scholar. For the hundreds of his masks, Franko had about 100 pen names. And Lesya Ukrainka, a well-educated and noble woman, she was nicknamed the daughter of Prometheus, the embodiment of power of spirit and endurance, a strong feminist. These three figures are so meaningful and important to Ukrainian literature that they still stand in spite of all the attempts of following generations to desacralize and dethrone them. And if speaking about the icons of Ukrainian literature, there are many more than just three. Even beyond Gogol, it has a lot of memorable and diverse personalities and texts. The Kaidash family by Ivan Nechoy Levitsky has been an archetypal family saga for already 2 centuries. It still feels quite contemporary. Or meet Olha Kobylyanska, who was on the wave of the start of Ukrainian feminism. Today, she still attracts the attention of more and more readers. Mikhailo Kotyubinsky is remembered not only as the author of The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, filmed by Serhiy Parajanov and Yuri Elienko, but also as a master of timeless psychological prose. The City, written by Valerian Pidmohelny, is a bright urbanistic novel proving that Ukrainian literature is not only about rural life. In the 1920s, Ukrainian literature was booming. It was a fruitful time for detective and love stories, sci-fi, women's prose, and travel reports. Entire genres returned and showed the power and self-sufficiency of Ukrainian literature. The Ukrainian avant-garde is asserting itself internationally. It's often the case that Ukrainian literature forms in spite of circumstances, as rebellion. It often had to overcome bans, repression, and colonial influence. That's how it was formed. For instance, Valuyev's decree banning the publishing of any religious and popular books in Ukrainian. The M's decree was the ban to publish and import any literature in Ukrainian, original or translated. Little changed after the fall of the Russian Empire. The Soviet system had been arresting and repressing the Ukrainian people of the arts and letters for a long time. Generations of dissidents cherished the dream of Ukraine, enduring prison and torture by the authorities. They literally risked their lives. One of the greatest Ukrainian poets, Vasyl Stus, was tortured to death in prison in 1985. The final publication of his poetry in the USSR during his lifetime was in 1966 in the Donbass Journal. The next one came out 4 years after his death in 1989. That seems like almost yesterday. Some friends of the poet are still alive, and so are his killers. Due to constant bans, to historical turbulence, and finally, because people always look for a better life, Ukrainian literature was written not only in Ukraine. In the 1920s, after a wave of emigration caused by the defeat of the national liberation struggle, the Prague School was formed. It was then that the distinct feature of Ukrainian literature in exile became apparent. Those authors were creating an alternative to official Soviet literature. It does not follow the compulsory canon of socialist realism. It takes up the trends of the world's top literature to criticize the Soviet system. Another powerful wave of Ukrainian emigrant writers was caused by the Second World War. In the refugee camps of the mostly American occupation zone, which held about 200,000 Ukrainians, the Ukrainian art movement was formed. Its Ukrainian acronym was MUR. It lasted for 3 years. During that time, more than 1,200 books and pamphlets had been written and published. In the Times of Mur, Tiger Hunters by Ivan Bahriane, Dr. Sereficus, and Without the Ground by Viktor Domontovich, and Ost by Ulas Samchuk were written or first published. In the 1950s, a new literary movement, the New York Group, was formed. Its members were people born in Ukraine but educated in the West after the war. These people associated themselves with New York, that is, with the dynamics, cosmopolitanism, artistic avant-garde, and fascination with the vibe of the sprawling metropolis. In 1961, the magazine Suchasnist was founded in Munich. It had been published for 30 years in Germany, then in the United States. This journal became one of the most important platforms for Ukrainian diaspora intellectuals. The role of Ukrainian ambassador was taken by the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the Ukrainian Research Institute of Harvard University. This is what Ukrainian-American Slavic scholar Yuri Shevelyov said about Ukrainian literature in exile. If we could not have our homeland on the map, we could build it in our souls. And that they did. Symbolically, Ukrainian postmodernism started, according to one view, after the Chornobyl disaster. Because people of letters tried to fight the feeling of the apocalypse with irony and a new approach to understanding both the role of the writer and the very idea of literature. In the mid-1980s, new literary groups were formed. The most well-known was founded by Yuri Andrukhovich, Viktor Neborak, and Alexander Irvanets a year before the Chernobyl disaster. It was called Boo-Ba-Boo for burlesque, balagan, cheap show, buffoonery. It did much for the development of irony as a weapon against established cliches and restrictions. Alexander Irvanets made a mockery of the socialist canon, one of his key styles. Yuri Andrukhovich's novel Recreations and Moskoviada became two important texts for understanding the Ukrainian post-colonial discourse. An even harsher laugh was that of Les Podrevyansky's. The witty and universal formulas for describing reality from his plays are still used today.
Вони шукають те, чого нема, щоб довести, що його не існує.
But Chernobyl is not the only starting point for modern Ukrainian literature. Such a point could be the founding of the magazine Chetver, Thursday, in 1989. It gathered a community of talented authors. Many of them were from Ivano-Frankivsk. The original name of the city was Stanislav, so this collective was nicknamed the Stanislav Phenomenon. Or we can start in 1996, when the novel Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex by Oksana Zabushko, now internationally famous, was first published. But no matter what date we choose, Ukraine of the 1990s and Ukraine at the beginning of the 21st century is an ideology-free space of play with old colonial myths, players harnessing them for their own aesthetic tasks. Irony, parody, and carnival is our everything, plus some uncontrolled element of Ukrainian burlesque. 2014 changed everything. After the Revolution of Dignity, the annexation of Crimea, and the hybrid Russian-Ukrainian war, several radical transformations in society, culture, and of course, literature have taken place. Writers go to war. And some defenders of Ukraine, who probably had never imagined themselves in literature before, are transforming their experience into texts. The most interesting literary phenomena of recent years is about understanding the war and its consequences, one way or another. A few famous books in the 21st century, however strange and sad they may be, appear in the tradition of the memoirs written in Soviet prison camps or about them. This reality is so eventful that Ukrainian nonfiction and essays have been flourishing in recent years. Ukrainians are increasingly aware of their identity. As a result, we are more interested in our history, art, traditions, and novelty in all their manifestations. After Maidan, new cultural institutions are formed. A lot of small niche publishing houses are founded. Some new and experimental ways of literary distribution are tried. new literary festivals take place all over the country, the boom of Ukrainian literature still goes on. And if this process is not interrupted, then very soon we will have a generation that will not need to start everything all over again. This generation will be able to live a long and happy life, realizing all their dreams. And they will have readers who will discover Ukrainian literature and accept it as their own. These Ukrainian readers will feel that they have things to be proud of, to write about, and to dream about, and that we Ukrainians have memories and new stories to share with the world. Because Ukrainian literature is a heart and mind that fights together, works together, beats together, works in unison. Together, they create whole worlds.